I'd like to introduce our guest speakers for the event today. Our first speaker here is Lau Ying-wai. He's a Master of Fine Arts. He graduated from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he's an art critic and an exhibition curator. And since 1997, Lau has written a daily column, This Moment, in the Hong Kong Economic Journal, and is mostly involved in food reviews. He has a delicious restaurant. He's also the founder of a new generation of private kitchen dishes, and publications include Landscape in the Mirror, Inside and Outside the Frame, Glowing Landscape, Love and Sexuality. And he's also the recipient of the Asian Cultural Council grant in 1986. Oh, 1988. And next we have Michelle Wong. She's the researcher based in Hong Kong. From 2012 to 2020, she was a researcher at Asian Art Archives, focusing on Hong Kong art history and histories of exchange and circulation through exhibitions and periodicals. She curated Portals, Stories, and Other Journeys at Daegu in 2021, and was part of the curatorial team for the Yokohama Triennial in 2020, and the 11th edition of Guangxi Biennial in 2016. Her writing has been published in Ambitious Alignments, New Histories of Southeast Asian Art, 1945 to 1990, the Journal of Southeast of Now in 2019, among others. And she is currently a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Hong Kong. And lastly, we have Parker Fay. He is the director of Ning Fei Studio, and recently he co-published Ning Fei's 424-page artist monograph entitled Journey into Nature, which we launched during the opening of this exhibition in September. And we have copies in the back later for sale if anybody's interested. He manages all aspects of the art studio, including coordinating and installing exhibitions. He was instrumental in putting together this mini retrospective that we have for Ning Fei here. He also oversaw the submission of the Ning Fei Archive of New York University Library's special collections. He holds a master's degree from Columbia University and completed his undergraduate degree at Johns Hopkins University. So, can we each give them an applause just for So, for the format of the talk, go through, I have a few questions to ask them, and we'll discuss Ning Fei's artistic journey. And then afterwards, we will have a Q&A, so if you could just hold your questions for the end, we'll save some time for that. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Ying-wai.
Did you want to show the...
Oh yes, sorry, I forgot. We have a short video slideshow here, just to kind of set the tone to talk about, to introduce Ning Fei basically, so that we all have kind of starting from the same foundation. Actually, I just wanted to briefly introduce Ming Fei, in case for those of you who didn't know him. He is a New York City-based artist, a Chinese American, whose work focuses primarily on the relationship between humankind and nature. And he was born in Shanghai in 1943, and he grew up in Hong Kong, and then he moved to the US in 1961 to attend Columbus College of Arts and Design. There he received his BFA from Kansas City Art Institute and an MFA at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he since then has remained in New York for the rest of his life. And he traveled back and forth to Hong Kong, and he did teach here at the university, but he basically has created his entire artistic career based in New York. So with that, I'd like to ask Bing Lai, how did you meet Ming Fei, and when was this?
Sorry, my English expression is not that good, so definitely will do the translation for me. 我啱啱認識阿飛咧就係1986年，就係喺 Edison Fine Arts 嗰度搞展覽。咁嗰時我喺報紙度寫評論，我就寫咗一篇關於個展覽嘅文章。
Okay, so like when I first met Ming Fei in 1986 when Allison Fine Arts held our first exhibition for the artist. At the time he was an art critic, so he wrote a piece in the newspaper on the exhibition.
始終佢喺香港喺紐約啊，咁我哋更多接觸咧就係1988年之後。1988年咧我就攞咗Asian Cultural Council 嘅獎學金，就去咗紐約住咗幾個月，咁咧就同阿飛咧就傾好多，即係大家了解多咗就。
So in 1988, he received the fellowship from the Asian Cultural Council, and he had a chance to go to New York. And that was when he had the opportunity to meet Ming Fei again and to speak to him and learn more about him.
咁嗰時我同喺香港、喺美國嗰班嘅藝術家都比較熟悉嘅，包括丁哩包括司徒強Jerry Guan咁一班，但係喺我嘅印象裏頭咧，Ming Fei咧就係比較多思想嘅比較心思嘅一個。
So during that time when he was there, he also met with other Hong Kong-based artists, Hong Kong artists based in New York, and those included Bing Li, Si Ho Kang, and Jerry Kwan. And from his observation, he felt that Ming Fei was one of the more mature artists and was more sensitive.
我諗咧，呢個唔單止係佢年紀比較其他嘅藝術家大咧，最主要就話佢嗰個文化嘅經驗咧，都係比較深啲嘅。
This was not only because he was slightly older than the others, but also because he had more experience and had been in the U.S. longer. So he had, I guess, been more entrenched in the U.S. art scene already.
即係佢同我講過一啲説話咧，即係到我依家咧都仲記得好清楚，或者經常咧係同啲朋友或者喺文章度提到。
Sorry.
即係佢有啲説話咧係令我嗰個記憶係好深嘅。我依家都經常會同嗰啲朋友再提。
Yeah, so during his conversation, he still remembers a lot of the things that he and Ming Fei had talked about, and oftentimes he would still bring that conversation up with his friends.
咁其中一樣嘢佢就係話，其實香港人咧就覺得你攞5000萬拍到一套電影咧，好似有1億嘅效果咧，至拍到出嚟嘅效果咧，咁個個都話你好叻仔嘅。
So one of the things he said was, if you have $50,000 and you can make a film that is worth $100,000, then everybody will say, oh, you're so smart and so clever that you're able to do that.
但係佢咧發覺，即係美國人唔會係咁樣諗嘅，因為美國人佢拍1億嘅電影，佢就攞1億去拍，佢唔會諗攞5000萬拍到1億嘅效果出嚟。
Yeah, and he thought that was kind of a strange concept because in America, if you have $1 million and you make a film that's worth $1 million, you wouldn't make a film that is, worth $500,000.
咁啊，我諗呢個咧就係好香港人嘅價值觀或者個 mentality， 即係啲所謂叻仔。咁其實咧，如果你唔喺制度咧，你唔會有個反省嘅。正如佢即係同我講另外一句話就係話，你唔去到另外一個空間咧，你係攞唔到另外一啲嘢。
Yeah, so he said that's a very the thought about the 500,000 producing a film of 1 million is a very Hong Kong way of thinking, and that he realized that if you don't go away, you leave Hong Kong, you wouldn't be able to receive, get this other type of knowledge. You'll kind of always remain in this thought pattern.
所以每一次嗰類咁樣嘅對話咧，即係我都會覺得好開心，因為會俾自己好多啟發。
So he is very happy when he has these conversations with Ming Fei because it gives him a lot of new inspiration.
咁樣咧就係其實當我哋講到 Ming Fei咧，即係一方面我哋睇個藝術啦，但係佢個經歷咧，我諗同樣係值得我哋去重視，就係佢個文化經驗。
So not only is he, he respects his art, but he also expects his opinion in terms of his cultural experience.
對我嚟講咧，佢係唔單止係佢仲代表咗好幾個香港去美國發展嘅藝術家。
Yeah, so he's very representative of an artist who went from Hong Kong to the U.S. to develop his career.
咁佢哋走過嘅路咧係非常之艱辛嘅。
And the kind of the road that or the path that these artists have to take is actually very difficult.
咁啊，呢個咧就係作為一個亞洲人咧，其實你要喺美國嗰個社會啦，即係尤其喺藝術界咧，佔一席位咧係非常之困難。
So as an Asian going to the U.S., actually to be able to break into the artistic circle is something that is very, very difficult.
呢個唔係我個人嘅觀察，而係包括喺亞洲最成功嘅一個藝術家，就係 Nam June Paik， 即係佢都曾經同我講過，係即係佢覺得咧亞洲人喺西方社會咧係得到嘅機會係好少嘅。
So this is not only his observation, but it's also an observation of a very well-known Korean artist, Nam June Paik, that Ying Wei had met. That he said that it was very, very difficult for an Asian artist to break through in the US.
咁樣喺佢話佢係比較好彩，佢同埋趙無極啦都係。咁佢哋係遇到，即係喺50年代咧，遇到一啲類似中國宋朝嗰啲貴族。然後去賞識佢，同埋去打擾佢哋。
Yeah, so he said Nam June Paik and also someone like Zhao Qi, they were both very, very lucky because in the 1950s they were able to meet some kind of wealthy art patrons.
咁即係佢都話咧，尤其喺 Manhattan 生存係好困難嘅。佢都話佢想寫一本Manhattan 嘅戰國策。
Yeah, so he said living in Manhattan is very difficult, and he wants to write a book about kind of the Manhattan battlefields.
咁樣即係其實可以想象咧，其實我哋睇翻香港去美國發展藝術嘅咧，最早就係Ming Fei同埋Lucius Wong，咁佢哋咧1961年去嘅。
Yeah, so the earliest artist who went overseas, besides Ming Fei, there's also Lucius Wong, and they went in 1961.
之後有Jerry Guang 有Bing Lee 有郭孟浩。
Yeah, the others then included Jerry Kwan, Bing Lee, and Frog King.
咁佢哋其實都係 非常之艱苦啦喺嗰度，無論喺藝術創作嚟講，或者現實生活上啦。
Yeah, so it's really a struggle for them not only in their artistic creation but also just in daily life.
咁即使咧比較幸運嗰個咧係司徒強啊。
Yeah, so one that was more lucky was probably Sidoka.
咁佢因為佢咧可以做個全職嘅藝術家，即係有畫廊代理佢嘅作品。
Yeah, because he was able to find a gallery there that represented him.
但係即使係咁啦，到佢係10年前到啦，佢過身咧係如果你 Google 咧用佢個名去 Google 咧係揾唔到任何結果嘅。
Yeah, so if you, even though he had found success when he was in New York, maybe like 10 years ago, if you go into Google and you look for his name, it still doesn't come up.
即係我想講就係話，其實你可以想像到佢哋行嗰條路係幾咁辛苦，但係所以咁樣去睇咧，阿明飛如果你睇翻佢嗰本書咧，一生人做咗咁多嘢咧，其實真係好值得尊敬。
Yeah, so the reason why he was talking about these other Hong Kong artists who went to the U.S. to try to establish an artistic career is just to put it into perspective. So if you look at Ming Fei, and we recently published a monograph on his career, that if you read that book and you can see, and also from the slideshow, all the achievements that he's made, if you put it into that context, it's actually really quite amazing what he's been able to do.
所以其實我都好希望好似香港藝術館咁樣，應該去搞翻呢個系列嘅展覽，就將嗰幾個香港去美國嘅藝術家佢哋做過嘅嘢咧，重新向公眾展示一次。
Yeah, so I think he's saying that it'll be really good. He's suggesting that if the Hong Kong Museum of Art can curate an exhibition where they introduce these artists who have left Hong Kong and developed a career in the U.S., just to kind of tell the story about their struggles and their successes. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. I will ask the same questions to Michelle. I know that you met Ming Fei very briefly in New York, much later in his career, but maybe if you could talk about how you came across his work in the first place.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming here. I just also wanted to thank the community and Sam for being here. It's really nice to sort of talk about an artist who we sort of meet at different points of our lives. I met Ming Fei in person probably also at Parker, I think 2017 would be in New York, and we were at a cafe somewhere in New York City. And I had gone to New York for work at the time at Asia Archive, and sort of found myself looking into the documents in the Fales Library in NYU. And at the time, I was working on this personal archive of a late artist called Ha Picture, and Ha Picture went to New York in 1983 and visited Ming Fei there, and that was actually the first time that I saw Ming Fei's image and the image of his work. I wonder if we can go to the PowerPoint, because I actually found one of those photos. And yeah, so it's through Ming Fei, it's this particular photo that I encountered Ming Fei and his work, and how, so I got an idea of how he was playing a really important role for artists who were visiting from Hong Kong and Asia, and sort of opening up his house as a place for people to stop by and just to gather. And of course, in the picture you see sort of these iconic sculptures of the pears and the other fruits, and also on the top of the shelf some of those seeds. So that's how I got to the Fales Library, and then the next slide, where I then sort of discovered or encountered the Epoxy Art Group, which are then contained the protagonists that Sam was talking about. But it was very striking to see how these artists who were sort of left their hometowns and sort of trying to build a life in New York and being so lively and having so much fun. And what really struck me for Epoxy was that they were a group of artists who banded together and worked collectively and presented their work in the name of Epoxy Art Group rather than their individual names. which is for me at the time is quite a different concept of what you come across an artist whose body of work is always attached to their name. But for epoxy, then they would have meetings and come up with projects and have to do homework and gather and present their homework. So you can sort of imagine that being a very enlightening process. So that's sort of kind of how I met Ming Fei and started studying meandering.
Thank you for sharing that, Michelle. So Park, for those of you who don't know, actually Park is Ming Fei's son. So maybe when you met him, but if you could talk about what it was like growing up with him.
Sure, I mean, you guys see all the sculptures around here, so imagine that times like 1,000 in a space that's like 3 times as big as this gallery. I grew up in downtown Manhattan in the Union Square area, and our loft was basically split in half. We had half that was studio, and then half which was living space. And my dad's studio is crazy. It's chaotic. It's messy. He's a hoarder. These sculptures were part of my playground. They were like sort of in the background of my playground, if you will. And I think about sculpture. If any of you guys have sculpture in your living space, it sort of like forces you to look at things differently. I like to look at the different ways the light reflects off the sculpture or the shadows during different times of the day. But yeah, my dad is he's a professor as well. He's a great storyteller. He's got a great sense of humor. He's also got a very strong work ethic, and I think that's part of his immigrant story, coming to New York, studying on full-ride scholarships throughout all of his art school, all the way through his MFA program. So we always had that, I think, starving artist mentality. And it's interesting when you look at the context. I came in the picture in New York in the 80s. But before that, when he was in art school, he was actually doing really large-scale steel geometric sculptures. And actually moving to New York, I feel like was a forcing function to reevaluate the materials he was using for his artwork, in terms of accessibility, in terms of economics, and paper mache, as you guys can see here, is a big part of the sculptures that you see at this show here. I also feel paper mache has a connection back to Chinese culture and the history of Chinese paper making, etc. So yeah, the environment in which I grew up in was filled with all these sculptures, and I've sort of seen the evolution of them over time. I guess I had my own relationship with the sculptures as well, and which is why I'm also here and I'm helping with the installation for all these shows. Some of you may have seen the Art College installation as well, with the Hong Kong Museum of Art installation last year. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. So now that we've talked a little bit about Ming Fei as a person and kind of the background of where he developed his artistic career, I wanted to talk a little bit about him as an artist and his creation. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists, how they view his artistic creation and then the process of how he reached A to B. And so I'm thinking I'd like to start with Michelle, because she's going to talk a little bit about the epoxy group, which she had mentioned before, because that was probably the earliest point of when he first got to New York. He got together with these other Hong Kong artists. So Michelle, if you could talk a little bit about the epoxy group.
Yeah, sure. Sort of jumped into talking about epoxy because they were so cool. But I think I was sort of reflecting about this last night, about how the Ming has always sort of made these sculptures as his own artistic practice, and then for 10 years, around 82 to 92, also worked as part of the epoxy art group. And then to then see these two ways of working, and they work very, very differently. To see them as parallel practices seems to be quite interesting. The epoxy group were sort of part of the downtown scene in New York, and at the time, you know, kind of chaotic, I guess. So you can really see them quite free and just playing. And so a lot of the work, like I was saying earlier on about epoxy, is that they sort of worked in a very guerrilla manner. And one of the things that they use a lot is the Xerox machine. And we can go to the postcards. And this is one of the most sort of striking finds that my former colleague and Ali Wong is also here. And we've sort of dealt with these photocopied postcards for a long time, sort of digitizing them. But I first encountered these again in the Fales Library, and then upon sort of looking at them more closely, I realized that these are then sort of reflections on the upcoming handover and therefore in theory decolonization of Hong Kong in 1997. But this is actually a series of postcards made in 1992. So for that for me was sort of a mind-bending situation where here you have an artist who left Hong Kong in the 60s, still thinking about that place that he grew up in, thinking about the future when it's still the past, and working with such everyday material, collecting different images from sort of different visual sources, and then collaging them together. And I believe afterwards photocopying them to create a new image. And I just find that, I guess it's a very 80s, 90s kind of thing that people would do, but I also find you can almost see it as they were thinking through this place through a very tactile way of working with paper and images and text, which then I find, and these postcards were just then sitting in a folder in the Fales for years until sort of we were able to find them again, and it has since gotten a new life. And I just found that very inspiring because many artists continue to want to go to New York, where it continues to be a place of exploration, a place of dreams, of different possibilities. And then to see someone who's from such a much earlier generation also sharing that, I think for me at least as a young person, it's very inspiring that it links me to an older generation, and I still relate to sort of New Yorkers in a very particular way. And you can also see in the next slide then, like as Osman was saying, that New York is a very difficult place to survive. So epoxy also tries to sort of play with that strategy of survival, but then doing that through Xeroxes again, but also a commentary on current events, which then also I find extremely fascinating. And then if you look at these sort of works on paper and you sort of look at the sculptures that you have around you, it's such a vast world that an artist is creating and occupying, working alone and also working with others.
Thank you for sharing that. So maybe we'll then go on to Lucky White, who will share or talk a little bit about the different phases of Ming Fei's personal artistic development.
即係大家都睇呢度都好熟悉咧，就係話阿飛咧，你主要做一啲生果啊、貝殼啊，或者一啲核啊唔同嘅物體。
So, looking at the exhibition here, you can already see, and many of you probably are familiar with the fruits and the seeds that Ming Fei has created.
咁樣佢正好似西方都有一個靜物畫嘅傳統啦。咁其實當你睇啲嘢咧，佢背後咧係往往有好多文化嘅含義喺度。
Yeah, so if you think about still lives, actually in the West it's also a very strong tradition. But looking at Ming Fei's work, there is oftentimes cultural background information that is kind of imposed on these works.
係好多時就話佢借助啲嘢咧，就係 去表達一啲文化嘅意義啦。譬如話，即係可能一個你咧對西方人嚟講係個你，但係中國人咧，因為你咧就同分別，即係分離嗰個離，又係離。正如我哋講年年有餘，就係等於有多嘅嘢，即係其實都係咁樣文化嘅意思啦。
Yeah, so if we look at the Chinese culture, there's a lot of double meaning in things. So, for example, if we look at the pear, it's for a Westerner maybe a pear is just a pear, something that you eat. But for Chinese, there's many sayings. So for pear, it's like fanlei, which means parting, or for just another example for.
年年有餘好似我哋。
年年有餘 so every year is like
cross 個音。
Yeah, but yu is the same sound as fish in Chinese. So there's always a double meaning or a hidden meaning in a lot of the words and sayings. So Ming Fei has used that from his own Chinese cultural perspective, and it's subtly conveyed in his own work.
咁同樣就話佢唔單止係中國啦，就話呢個許願骨咁樣，嗰個又係英國嘅一個傳統，即係嗰啲人食到嗰條雞骨撕開嗰兩邊，然後許個願咁樣。
Yeah, so he not only borrows from Chinese culture, but he also borrows from Western culture. So, for example, there's hanging here in the wall. There's two wish bones, or chicken bones, I guess. But in the Western culture, they're like wish bones, where two people would each hold one side of the bone and then crack it, and then whoever gets the larger side gets to make the wish.
咁樣當然佢嘅創作方法咧，好受到當時呢個時代嘅影響。
And of course, his artistic creation was also influenced by what was going on in the art scene at the time.
我哋好熟悉佢嘅 approach 咧，就係將嗰啲嘢咧係放大好多倍。
So we're very familiar with his approach where he takes a small piece of fruit or something and he blows it up into a larger than life scale.
咁即係如果譬如話有一口針擺我哋嘅手掌咧，係微不足道㗎，係好細微嘅嘢嚟，好平凡嘅嘢。
Yeah, so like for example, if you have a needle and you put it in the palm of your hand, it's very small and it could just be seen as something very common.
但係如果你放大佢1000萬倍擺喺個廣場嘅中央咧，佢都係見到方圓物。
Yeah, but if you blow up that needle 1,000 times or 10,000 times, then it becomes something very monumental.
咁我諗阿飛都係經常用呢個方法咧，就係話將一啲好平凡我哋見到嘅嘢，將佢放大咗咧，然後咧又去產生另外一個意義。
Yeah, so this is the technique that Ming Fei is using, taking everyday objects and blowing them up to create a new feeling or new idea.
一方面係一啲文化嘅含義啦，另外一方面咧可能都係佢個人一啲生命嘅體會嚟嘅。
Yeah, so not only is it he's taking from his cultural background, but he's also taking from his own personal experiences.
咁呢度呢個展覽冇見咧，咁我覺得佢有一個系列係都幾震撼嘅，就係咧專係做一啲皮。
So one of the things that he finds very interesting in this exhibition is using the skin.
咁即係好似係動物或者甚至人成層皮咁樣掛喺度。
So not only human, but also like maybe animal skin.
咁變咗呢個係可以講都係記錄咗佢一啲對生命嘅一個體會啦。
So it's also reflective of his view on life.
咁樣咧就譬如話頭先我喺後邊嗰度班房度行咗個圈。
So for example, he said before the talk he spent some time in the exhibition and walked around in the back where we have some hanging installation.
咁我感覺咧，好似咧你經過咗4季嘅轉變。
It felt like to him walking in that room that he went through 4 different seasons.
或者個生命由 萌芽到盛到衰嘅一個過程。
So like it's part of a life cycle.
咁變咗尤其咧，我覺得佢到係佢晚年做嗰啲嘢咧係更加嘅成熟啦。
So speaking of his artistic process, he feels like the things that he did later in life are even more mature.
咁尤其咧，即係我最喜歡嘅就係喺香港藝術館，即係掛喺嗰個天花園。
So in particular, he really likes the piece that was recently displayed at the Hong Kong Museum of Art.
咁咧就因為嗰度咧同佢年輕嗰啲比較咧，無論個造型或者色彩咧係強烈咧，係同埋更有個性。
Yeah, so he felt like that piece, it was a hanging piece called the Monkey Pot. He felt it was the colors were very strong.
係即係一方面咧就係話係好嗰個繪畫性非常之強嘅，同埋即係啲色彩一堆堆咁樣堆積喺度。
Yeah, so the composition and the colors were very strong in the way it was displayed.
然後咧就係嗰啲有機嘅造型啦，就係咧係嗰個感覺係非常之強烈嘅。
And just the feeling of had a very strong organic feeling.
咁有一啲類似係性嘅暗示啦。
So this is the piece that we're talking about.
或者慾望同埋一個死亡嘅象徵，尤其我哋知道嗰個猴子湖，即係背後嗰個文化嘅含義。
So to him, it felt like it had a lot of about life and death, and also we know about the meaning behind the object, the colorful hanging pieces that he was talking about is known as the Monkey Pot, and they were. It was named this because it's about a monk in the Amazon where there are actual fruits that hang like this, and the monkeys would go there, and because inside there would be very, very sweet and delicious honey, and so the monkeys would go and put their hands in it and start tasting it, and it would be so good that they would eventually stick their whole head in, and it would get stuck.
咁即係對我嚟講，即係明飛係一個喺藝術上咧係好成功嘅一個例子啦。
So he feels that Ming Fei is a very, very successful artist.
所以我諗咧，當後邊啲人咧去再睇翻阿明飛咧，應該要記得佢嗰個文化嘅經驗。
Yeah, so when we look back at Ming Fei in particular, we should remember his cultural background.
咁樣會更體會到佢喺藝術上嘅成就。
Yeah, so then you would understand where he's coming from and the importance of him as an artist. Thank you. So maybe next we'll have, lastly, we'll have Park talk about Ming Fei's public art. So we've had Michelle talk about epoxy, and Ming Wei talk a little bit about his creations that were here and also in the Hong Kong Museum of Art. And there was also another side of Ming Fei who was able to do a lot of public art in America. So Park will share a little bit about that with us.
Well, yeah, before I go into the public art, I just wanted to also comment on a few things. I think epoxy is really interesting because the premise of epoxy starting was that Ming was hanging out with people like Bing Li and Jerry Kwan and Hua already socially, and they're like, why don't we do something different? Why don't we do something together as a group? And the premise of that was like, let's do something that we don't normally do as artists. Let's challenge ourselves and go try out and explore a different subject or a different medium and work together. So it's really interesting because like you'll see works like we were showing up there, like 36 Tactics using Xerox, and then you see this kind of work. So I think it shows sort of the depth of the type of work he was doing. And back to the first question about like what kind of, what was it like growing up with my dad? I think he's actually like quite the sort of amateur historian, if you will. We lived above this grand bookstore in Union Square, which is a very famous bookstore in downtown New York. That was essentially his library. So, and they have a big used book collection. So he's got loads of books on nature on seeds, on fruits, on Chinese history, on Chinese symbolism. Obviously, a lot of that informed some of his research in doing that. Another thing I want to point out is that in this room we have different categories of his artwork. We have fruits, we have seeds, we have seashells, we also have hybrids. And hybrid sculptures are based on something that he may have found in nature that was inspirational, but it was also reflects a period where he was creating his own garden, and creating hybrids allowed him to be sort of, creating his own hybrid variant, sort of going into the realm of sci-fi, and really sort of, making it a mid-fade garden, if you will. And one more thing about Ming as an artist in New York in the 70s and 80s as a Chinese artist. Socially, he's hanging out with a lot of other Chinese artists, and I think one of his differentiators is that I feel like he was really a master of both Chinese culture growing up in Hong Kong, but also of American culture, studying in America and having lived in New York for so long. And I think that plays into his work here as well as epoxy. All right, so let me, one of the things we haven't really talked about is the public art. I'm just going to go into this. This was, Ming has about 10 really prominent public art pieces in the US. These are permanent public art installations that anyone can go see. This is in New York, this is in Queens, this is at PS7. It's actually in Elmhurst, Queens. And you can see this school gate, it's actually in Elm Leaf. I think his hope was that kids entering the school would have something spiritual. But you can see that it was site-specific, it was looking at the local context, the local history. And this was created actually in the late 90s.
95.
Can't see from there. All right, this is down in Philadelphia. This is a spiral arc. It's in the Criminal Justice Center. There's actually 2 of them. They're made out of aluminum. They're approximately, I'm going to say, 10 feet long from top to bottom. And the spiral represents sort of the turns in a court hearing. This is the Ginkgo Berry Bois at Portland, at the Oregon Convention Center. This one is massive. The photo doesn't do it justice. The Ginkgo Berry Bois stands 14 feet tall and is like 2 tons. Actually, here on the floor, we've got 2 smaller versions of the Ginkgo Berry Bois, the green ones right there. These have been in the Pacific Northwest for a long time, and they're supposed to have healing properties as well. They were used by indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest for healing a long time ago. And again, another example of looking at site-specific history and specifically nature as an inspiration and a reminder to the people visiting. This is maybe the most popular one in New York. If you ever take the subway, Lower East Side, the F line, this is called Shag Crossing. The next stop on the train is you're going to Brooklyn, so you're about to go underwater and then pop up on the Brooklyn side. And this was really sort of a tribute to the shagfish, which at the time was getting scarce. And this is just a beautiful mosaic tile. On the other side is an orchard tree, which is also a reference to how 100 years ago there was a huge apple orchard in the Lower East Side. All right, this is pillar art. This stands 28 feet tall in downtown Seattle, outside the United States Courthouse Plaza. Pillar art is also a seed that you can find in the Pacific Northwest, and he chose to stand it upright, sort of also a nod to justice, if you will. It looks different during the day and it looks different and at night when it's split up. Here we have the Whitehall Crossing. This is at the Staten Island Ferry Terminal. If you're ever taking the ferry from Manhattan to Staten Island, you might be sitting on one of these benches if you're waiting for the ferry. This part of Manhattan is still the launching point to go to Staten Island, just as it was, 400 or 500 years ago when people were making the canoe voyage, if you will, from the tip of southern Manhattan to Staten Island. And if you look at those benches closely, it sort of resembles what might have been like a very old school canoe. This one is one of my favorites. This is down in Puerto Rico. It's called Arbo Magico. It's modeled after a coffee bean tree. Yauco is actually famous for their coffee bean production in Puerto Rico. So again, a nod to the local industry and the farming of coffee bean trees. But this one just has this magical thing. This is also almost like 30 feet tall, and really cool. All right, this is also in downtown Philadelphia, not far from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is a installation inside a private condo, part of the Percent for Art program down in Philly at the time. Also, it's inspired from Goldilocks, which is one of the also local plants, and yeah, these are glass, made out of glass, and the stems are made out of steel. And yeah, that's the sampling. There are a few more around, but I didn't show all of it, but just wanted to give you guys a sense of, again, the breadth and depth of permanent public art installations. If you guys are ever in one of those cities, I'd highly recommend go and see it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, I think, to see a different angle of the artist, because that's something that we as a gallery really can't display or show, those types of pieces. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that it's really interesting for Ming Fei that he was, from a Chinese artist who was from Shanghai and then came to Hong Kong and then moved to the U.S., that he was able to so successfully have a career in the U.S. and not only just as an individual artist, but to get a group of artists from Hong Kong together and to create the epoxy group, and then to have his own artistic development in different types of medium and sculpture and public art, and as well as he's also done watercolors and as well as the hanging installation pieces. So he's really quite a multi-talented artist in that way, I would say. So with that, I also wanted to ask each of the three of you what you think would be Ming Fei's legacy. How do you think art history is going to define him as an artist? Who would like to start?
即我諗呢個係同佢嗰個經驗有關啦，最主要就係唔同嘅文化經驗啦。好似你講喺上海出世，香港長大，然後美國讀藝術，然後跟住從事咗創作幾十年啦。咁佢個嗰個文化歷程咧係唔係咁多人有，所以我諗。呢一點係好重要咯，因為都係中西文化之間嘅一啲接觸所產生嘅作品。
Okay. So I think that you'd have to look at him from his experience, from somebody who grew up, was born in Shanghai, came to Hong Kong, and then studied in the U.S. and developed his career there, and really was able to successfully take his Chinese cultural heritage and what he saw and learned in the U.S. and combined it together to create what he has created.
即係變咗係呢個咁樣嘅創作經驗咧係好獨特嘅。
Yeah, so this is very unique, this type of experience, creative experience that Ming Fei has had.
咁同樣就係話我好似我哋頭先提到咧，就係話我哋都要留意翻就話佢係一個 group 嘅人，即係蕭浩強冰啲Jerry Kwan 即係佢哋喺香港 去美國發展嘅藝術家，咁佢哋咧都共同咧創作咗啲嘢嘅，所以我覺得應該譬如喺香港藝術館，好似我哋頭先講就其實好值得去搞一個系列嘅展覽，去介紹翻呢幾十個人佢哋嘅文化創作經驗。
Yeah, so he's reiterating that it's really important also to look at Ming Fei as an artist who is part of the group who had left Hong Kong to go to the U.S. And he thinks that this is an area that really should be explored further, and hopefully somewhere like the Hong Kong Museum of Art that in the future they can put an exhibition together to highlight this group of artists.
咁啊，另外咧喺佢個人嘅創作方面咧，我覺得都係好獨特嘅，尤其去到我聽講佢晚年做嗰啲懸掛嘅花園啦。
Yeah, and as an individual, he says in particular his hanging installations that he did later in his life are very important works.
咁佢嘅無論造型或者顏色咧，都係非常之獨特嘅。
Yeah, and the way the use of his color and also his creation are very individual.
咁即係屋繪畫感咧係非常之強嘅，好似好厚重嗰啲色彩堆積埋一齊咁樣。
Yeah, so the use of his color and his composition is very unique and very special. And the strength and I guess the combination of them together.
咁同埋嗰啲造型咧都係好充滿咗個人嘅感性嘅。
Yeah, and then the creation is very unique and very personal.
即係整體嚟講咧，佢嘅雕塑語言咧係非常之好表現性，好 expressive。
Yeah, his sculptural creation is very expressive.
咁我諗佢嗰啲作品咧，因為咁樣會俾人記住嘅。
Yeah, so because of that, it's something that will stay in people's minds forever.
I don't know if what I say matters in terms of his legacy, but I can share a little bit of what sort of really stuck with me, sort of getting to know Ming Fei's work, and even sort of learning from Mark all the time, is that, and also sort of resonating with what Lawson was just saying, like this sort of enlarging of scale, when you sort of enlarge something that's so quotidian, which is so much in your everyday life, and changing it into just a slightly off scale, whether it's sort of enlarging it or sort of even in some cases shrinking it. I feel like for me, it upsets my sense of time. And so you look at Ming Fei's sculpture, you don't know if you're looking at something that's from the past, like a wishbone, maybe it's like an archaeological object, or if it's something that's from a distant future that maybe they've genetically modified our food or food so much that they have come back and they're gonna crush us, that kind of thing. And for me, Ming's work has that sort of alien and sort of strangely mythical, but also familiar quality that you just sort of keep wanting to sort of. I always want to touch sculpture, for one. But then seeing the public works, and I also just realized that Ming is someone who cares deeply about the people with whom he lives around. He may know or may not know. And his works, then by inserting these works into the living environments, and they are often aspirational, or they have sort of well-wishes or sort of far-reaching goals and dreams in them. And I find that kind of actually very moving for an artist who has sort of left multiple homes to build a new one in a land much far away. To have that sort of wish for the people that he lives with is sort of just a new realization that I come to see. And I think that probably can be a really moving legacy for the family.
Thank you.
I feel like as kids, we all sort of like, go play outside and we would, pick up seeds on the ground and look at them and explore them. And I feel like part of what my dad is trying to do is he's trying to force us to confront nature again. And by making it large scale or human scale. It's forcing us to appreciate nature and its beauty and its symmetry and its beautiful design. So I think that is maybe one big takeaway for a lot of people. In terms of his legacy in the history books, I think he's just as much a downtown New York artist as he is a Hong Kong artist. He's probably a hybrid of that, and his art is reflective of that. I think the posse is an important part of his career in looking at Asian American art collectives in New York or in the U.S. And from a Hong Kong historical perspective, maybe he's in this group of diaspora artists, like Mr. Lau was talking about that. That's a subject matter that be explored more in the future as well. And I just published with Daphne a 420-page monograph. Initially, I remember like when I first talked to Daphne about it, I was like, I'll be 100 or 200 pages. There's so much material. This guy was so prolific. I mean, there's so much art, and we didn't even capture everything in that monograph. There's more. So yeah, he was incredibly prolific. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think definitely in terms of developing his legacy from the gallery standpoint, producing something like this monograph that's over 400 pages that kind of outlines his artistic career and, like you said, didn't cover everything, but I think touched on all the key points and key moments of his artistic development is something really important. So we've kind of run out of time. We did have a last question that we were going to ask everybody, but I don't know if we should maybe open it up to the floor first to see if there's any questions, and then we can go back to that question. Yes.
I wanted to make a comment because your mom, Alice King, was so important for the development of contemporary art in Hong Kong and encouraging artists. And she's the one who really donated the Ning Fei War Museum. And after many years in storage, when we finally saw it hanging up, it was a very touching moment, actually. And thank you for sort of explaining it and putting a focus on it. I think your suggestion to make an exhibition eventually of these artists would be really meaningful. I will take away this message. Yeah. Since I helped the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and I know they like the work very much. So thank you for it. It's not really a question, but I just want to say that.
Thank you for sharing that comment. Are there any other questions?
Yep. I was just curious. I've seen Ning Fei's works at fairs at the gallery, Daphne, but I don't know his practice very well. So what I've noticed is that the fruits that he has on display, it's always one single fruit. Whereas, let's say, if you would see a grape, for instance, if you a bunch of grapes or like, a bowl of apples, But his fruits are always just, kind of standalone. Is there any sort of reason or maybe visually you prefer single fruits?
I've definitely seen installation shots where there's multiple, like pears or multiple oranges all together. I think more recently we might have decided to go, just showing variety rather than having multiple of one. But yeah, I don't know if there was a certain decision about one way or another, in the past. But I have seen both.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing in the monograph there was a picture of an exhibition where it was just oranges and huge oranges and many oranges placed together. So I think it's just a matter.
More oranges, more good luck. So
yeah. Yeah. Are there any other questions in the audience? No, okay, I'll go on to my last question that I think is quite interesting too. I was going to ask each one of them which one is their favorite piece of artwork in this exhibition.
我都係 最中意嗰個 museum arts 嗰個 gallery。
Okay, so not one that's here in the exhibition, but still the one at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and I hope that many of you here had the opportunity to see it. It was on display for I think almost 6 months as part of an exhibition called Not a Fashion Show, and I think we had an image of it here. But it's not dissimilar to the piece that is back here in the exhibition, but the one at the Hong Kong Museum of Art had these really big, powerful monkey punks that are not here. So it's in theory similar, but not the same piece. Yeah. And I think what's so wonderful about Ming Fei's artwork, especially these hanging installations, is that it really conforms to the space where it is shown and where it is exhibited. Because this piece, is site-specific to the Hong Kong Museum of Art, that kind of corridor where they were showing it. And the piece that we have here at the exhibition, we especially installed it for that room. And for those of you who have not seen it yet, I highly suggest that you go in. It's more of an immersive experience because the pieces are hung lower, the ceiling is much lower, so you really feel like you're enveloped by the pieces. And actually, a lot of these pieces, the exact same work was on show at the Art Basel as the public installation art this past May. And I think we have a photo of that as well from Art Basel. It's the one, yeah, this piece. So as you can see, it's completely transformed and fits into the space, as well as a lot of the fruits that are underneath here, some of the pieces that are here at the gallery. So I think that's very unique in a sense that his artwork can be transformed to fit into a specific space as required. So sorry, Michelle.
I'll say my favorite piece, and I actually also have a question for Daphne. Well, I think my favorite piece, I toggle between the wishbone and actually the smaller fruits at the back room. The smaller fruits are ceramic, and the thing with ceramics is when you fire them, they actually shrink a little. So not only were they sort of smaller, they've gotten smaller in the process of making, and I find that sort of really fascinating. But my question for Daphne is also, because your gallery have shown Ming Fei for so many years, so I've always been curious to know, how was it for you to also encounter Ming Fei for so long?
Yeah, I guess I was quite young. Actually, I was, for those of you who don't know, the gallery was founded by my mother 40 years ago. We celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. And Ming Fei was one of the first artists that we did represent in the 1980s. We actually, the first exhibition I remember, we were showing actually his 2D images, his paint, his, I guess, watercolors and pastels on the wall. And from there, I met him, and I then had the opportunity to visit his studio in the late 80s. And at that time, Park was very young still, running around. As he said, it was his playground. Yeah, I think for me, I was really fascinated to go there, and because in the past, the artwork that I had seen growing up at home and in Hong Kong was Chinese, not necessarily, Chinese contemporary, so not necessarily very classical Chinese, but it was also not really Western. In a sense, the medium that was used was more like ink painting on rice paper, could be abstract, very contemporary. But when I went to visit Ming Fei's studio in Union Square in New York, I was really surprised to see a Chinese artist creating something that was so Westernized. And like Park had said, he really was part of New York City, downtown New York. And that kind of really was very eye-opening for me. Yeah. Besides it being a very cool loft, and I wondered where they lived. Because it was a studio loft where they actually lived, and I could see their kitchen, and I think some of the bedrooms were like up above. So I thought that was very cool. Yeah.
So I think the question was, what is my favorite piece in this show? I actually think the Tai Chi figures, which are in the back, they're bronze. The image up here is actually a mixed media version, wire armature with paper mache. this is around 2014, and my dad studied Tai Chi for about 15 or 20 years, and this was very much, him analyzing, studying that, and reflecting that here. I think if you look at the form, this is, for him, the most ideal form in terms of inner chi and outer form. And to me, when I look at them, they're very zen, they're very calm. And it was also sort of a departure from his earlier works, studying nature. It was sort of the first time that you saw humans inhabit his garden or his jungle. And I think they coexist harmoniously. And in the arc of his career, this would be a late stage, so I feel like this is sort of his master craftsmanship in a new era, and I think they're really great.
Okay, thank you. And there's some people who just arrived, so I want to give them the opportunity too, if they had any questions before we end our session. Yeah, okay. Well, with that, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for those of you who are online. And for those of you who are here, we do have some wine, and please stay around and have a look at the exhibition, and we're all here, so we're happy to answer any questions personally. Thank you. Thank you.